Deep in the heart of Kenya's Masai Mara, wildlife rangers discovered something that would challenge everything they knew about elephant memory and devotion. The Masai Mara National Reserve stretched endlessly under the African sun, its golden grasslands punctuated by scattered acacia trees and the distant calls of wildlife. This protected sanctuary had become home to countless rescued animals over the decades, but none quite like Django. Django was an 8-year-old elephant calf who had arrived at the reserve 2 years prior under tragic circumstances. His massive frame, still small for his species, bore the gentle curves and oversized ears characteristic of African elephants. His tusks were just beginning to show, small ivory points that caught the morning light as he moved through his daily routine. But Django's routine was unlike any other elephant in the reserve. Every morning, as the first rays of sunlight painted the savanna gold, Django would walk with determined steps to the same spot near the reserve's main entrance road. There, beneath a lone fever tree whose yellow bark had been polished smooth by countless animals seeking shade, Django would position himself and begin his vigil. The rangers had initially dismissed this behavior as typical adjustment stress. Rescued elephants often displayed unusual patterns as they adapted to their new environment. Dr. Emily Richardson, the reserve's chief veterinarian, had observed similar cases during her 15 years working in wildlife conservation. Elephants were highly intelligent creatures with complex social needs, and trauma could manifest in various ways. However, as weeks turned to months, and months stretched into 2 full years, Django's behavior remained unchanged. Rain or shine, through the dry season's scorching heat and the wet season's torrential downpours, Django maintained his post. His massive bulk had worn a permanent depression in the red earth where he sat, and the fever tree's shade had become his constant companion. The other elephants in the reserve had long since given up trying to integrate Django into their social structures. Elephants are deeply social animals, living in matriarchal herds with complex relationships and hierarchies. The resident herd, led by an ancient matriarch named Temba, had initially attempted to welcome Django. They would approach him with gentle rumbles, extended trunks seeking contact, and patient invitations to join their daily migrations across the reserve. But Django remained unmoved. He would acknowledge their presence with brief trunk touches or soft rumbles, but he never left his position. Even during feeding times, when the other elephants gathered at the reserve's watering holes or moved to fresh grazing areas, Django would only venture far enough to grab nearby vegetation before returning to his spot. As the second year of this behavior concluded, Dr. Richardson could no longer ignore the signs of Django's declining health. His once robust skin had developed patches of infection, common when elephants spent too much time in one location without the natural movement that kept their skin healthy. His ribs had become more prominent as his weight dropped, and his eyes held a distant, almost hollow expression that spoke of deep emotional pain. The veterinary team had tried various interventions. They relocated food sources to encourage movement, introduced new elephants to stimulate social interest, and even attempted to physically guide Django to different areas of the reserve. Nothing worked. Django would comply temporarily, but always returned to his vigil beneath the fever tree. What puzzled Dr. Richardson most was Django's behavior when vehicles passed on the main road. The reserve's entrance road saw regular traffic: safari vehicles, supply trucks, and local community members traveling between villages. Most animals either ignored these vehicles or moved away from the road entirely. Django did the opposite. Whenever a vehicle appeared in the distance, Django would rise to his feet with remarkable speed for such a large animal. His massive ears would flap forward, and his trunk would extend toward the road as if testing the air for familiar scents. His entire body would tense with anticipation, and he would take several steps toward the road's edge, stopped only by the reserve's protective fencing. As each vehicle passed without stopping, Django's posture would deflate. His head would lower, his ears would slump, and he would return to his sitting position with movements that seemed to carry the weight of disappointment. This pattern repeated dozens of times each day, with Django showing the same hopeful anticipation followed by the same crushing disappointment. The rangers began to speculate about what might be driving this behavior. Some suggested Django was waiting for his mother, despite clear evidence that she had been killed by poachers. Others theorized that he was experiencing a form of elephant PTSD, stuck in a loop of traumatic memory. Dr. Richardson suspected something more complex was at work. Elephants possessed remarkable memories, capable of recognizing individuals after decades of separation and navigating to distant water sources based on generational knowledge. If Django was waiting, he was waiting for something specific, something his elephant mind associated with that particular road and that particular location. The mystery deepened when Dr. Richardson reviewed Django's rescue records more carefully. The files contained basic information about his arrival at the reserve: his age, estimated weight, health condition upon arrival, and the circumstances of his rescue, but the details were sparse. Typical of emergency rescues, where immediate medical care took precedence over comprehensive documentation. What stood out was a note about Django's initial behavior upon arrival. Unlike most rescued elephants who arrived traumatized and resistant to human contact, Django had been remarkably calm. He had allowed the veterinary team to examine him without sedation, had accepted food readily, and had shown no signs of the aggressive or fearful behavior common in recently orphaned calves. This suggested that Django had experienced positive human contact before his arrival at the reserve. Most wild elephants, even young ones, retained a natural wariness of humans. Django's comfort with people indicated he had been cared for by humans who had earned his trust. Humans he had learned to associate with safety and care. As Dr. Richardson watched Django begin another day of waiting, she realized this wasn't just grief or trauma. This was hope. Django was waiting for someone specific to return, someone he trusted completely. But after 2 years, whoever Django was waiting for either didn't know where he was or couldn't reach him. The implications were heartbreaking. If Django continued this vigil much longer, his health would deteriorate beyond recovery. Elephants could literally die of broken hearts, their complex emotional lives making them vulnerable to stress-related illnesses that could prove fatal. Dr. Emily Richardson realized this wasn't just grief. Django was waiting for something. But what could keep an elephant anchored to one spot for 2 entire years? Dr. Emily Richardson had spent her career studying animal behavior, but Django's case demanded investigation beyond standard veterinary practice. She began documenting his daily routine with scientific precision, noting every detail of his behavior patterns, physical responses, and interactions with his environment. Her observations confirmed what she had suspected. Django's behavior was highly specific and purposeful. He didn't simply wait passively beneath the fever tree. His positioning was precise, always facing the same direction along the road, always at the same distance from the fence. When vehicles approached, his responses varied based on the type of vehicle, the time of day, and even the weather conditions. Dr. Richardson noticed that Django showed the strongest reactions to older, well-used vehicles rather than the newer safari trucks that frequented the area. His response was particularly intense when he encountered vehicles carrying the scents of livestock or cooking fires, smells associated with local Maasai communities rather than tourists or researchers. These observations led Dr. Richardson to examine Django's rescue file more thoroughly. She contacted the Regional Wildlife Authority and traced the original rescue operation back to its source. What she discovered changed her understanding of Django's story entirely. The rescue hadn't been a typical Wildlife Authority operation. Instead, it had been initiated by a local Maasai community who had contacted the authorities about an orphaned elephant calf in their area. The community had been caring for Django for 3 months before the wildlife authorities could arrange for his transfer to the reserve. This revelation explained everything. Django hadn't come directly from the wild to the reserve. He had spent a crucial period of his young life being cared for by humans who had shown him kindness during his most vulnerable time. These weren't wildlife professionals or researchers. They were community members who had taken in an orphaned elephant out of compassion. Dr. Richardson's investigation led her to a small Maasai village approximately 50 kilometers from the reserve. The village elder, contacted through a network of community liaisons, remembered the elephant calf clearly. The story that emerged painted a picture of extraordinary human-animal connection. 2 years prior, Kamau Lekashan, a respected member of the community, had been returning from market when he discovered Django beside his mother's body. Poachers had killed the adult elephant for her tusks, leaving the young calf traumatized and alone. Kamau, despite the potential dangers and legal complications of harboring a wild elephant, couldn't abandon the orphaned calf. Kamau brought Django to his homestead, where his 12-year-old daughter, Nasirian, immediately bonded with the young elephant. For 3 months, Django became part of their family. Nasirian would sing traditional Maasai songs to comfort him during his nightmares. Kamau would walk with Jengo to grazing areas and teach him which plants were safe to eat. The entire extended family participated in Jengo's care, creating a support network that helped him process his trauma. The arrangement couldn't last indefinitely. Keeping a wild elephant, even an orphaned one, was illegal without proper permits. Additionally, as Jengo grew larger and stronger, the safety risks increased. Kamau made the difficult decision to contact the wildlife authorities, knowing that Jengo would receive proper care at a professional facility. The transfer had been coordinated carefully to minimize trauma. Kamau and Nasirian had accompanied Jengo to the reserve, staying with him for several days to help with the transition. They had left personal items, clothing with their scents, samples of foods Jengo particularly enjoyed, recordings of Nasirian's songs to help him remember them during the adjustment period. But institutional policies at the reserve discouraged ongoing contact between rescued animals and their temporary caregivers. The reasoning was sound from a wildlife management perspective. Rescued animals needed to be prepared for eventual reintegration into wild populations or permanent sanctuary life. Maintaining human attachments could interfere with this process. What the policies failed to account for was the depth of emotional bonding that could occur between elephants and their human caregivers. Jengo hadn't simply been fed and sheltered by Kamau's family. He had been loved. He had experienced the security of belonging to a social group that cared for his well-being not as a wildlife management challenge, but as a family member. Dr. Richardson realized that Jengo's vigil wasn't random or pathological. He was waiting at the exact spot where he had last seen Kamau and Nasirian. The road he watched so intently was the same road they had traveled when they brought him to the reserve. His hope wasn't delusional. It was based on his last memory of the people who had cared for him most deeply. The tragedy was that Kamau and Nasirian had no idea Jengo was waiting for them. They had been told that maintaining contact would be harmful to Jengo's adjustment, so they had stayed away despite their own emotional attachment to him. They had mourned his loss just as he was mourning theirs, both parties suffering unnecessarily due to well-intentioned but misguided policies. As Dr. Richardson compiled this information, Jengo's health continued to decline. His skin infections had worsened despite treatment, and his weight loss was becoming critical. More concerning was his increasing withdrawal from environmental stimuli. He was displaying symptoms consistent with severe depression, a condition that could prove fatal in elephants. The medical team faced a crisis. Standard treatment protocols weren't addressing the root cause of Jengo's condition, which was fundamentally emotional rather than purely physical. Unless they could address his psychological distress, they risked losing him entirely. Dr. Richardson made a decision that went against established wildlife management protocols. She decided to contact Kamau's family and invite them to visit Jengo. The risk was significant. If the reunion didn't go as hoped, it could worsen Jengo's condition. But without intervention, he was likely to die anyway. After days of searching remote Maasai villages, Dr. Richardson found them. But would Kamau's family remember the little elephant they had saved? And, more importantly, would Jengo remember them? The journey to find Kamau's family took Dr. Richardson through landscapes that told the story of Kenya's complex relationship between wildlife conservation and traditional communities. The rutted dirt roads wound past small homesteads, where Maasai families maintained their traditional pastoral lifestyle alongside the pressures of modernization. Cattle and goats grazed in areas that had once teemed with wild game, while children in school uniforms walked alongside elders draped in traditional red shukas. Dr. Richardson's Land Rover kicked up clouds of red dust as she navigated between scattered acacia trees and termite mounds that rose like ancient monuments from the savannah. The GPS coordinates from her research had led her to a general area, but finding specific families in the vast landscape required local knowledge and patient inquiry. Her breakthrough came at a small market town where traders gathered weekly to exchange goods and news. An elderly woman selling beaded jewelry remembered hearing about a family that had cared for an elephant calf. She pointed toward a cluster of traditional bomas, circular homesteads surrounded by thorn bush fences, visible in the distance across the rolling grassland. As Dr. Richardson approached the homestead, she could see the classic signs of Maasai pastoral life: circular mud and dung houses with thatched roofs, cattle corrals constructed from thorny branches, and the distinctive red ochre decoration that marked traditional architecture. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and the sound of lowing cattle mixed with children's laughter. Kamau Lekishon emerged from his house as the Land Rover approached. He was a man in his 40s with the lean, dignified bearing of someone accustomed to the challenges of pastoral life. His weathered hands and keen eyes spoke of decades spent reading the subtle signs of weather, wildlife, and livestock health that determined survival in this harsh but beautiful landscape. When Dr. Richardson introduced herself and explained her mission, Kamau's expression shifted through surprise, concern, and finally, deep emotion. He called for his daughter Nasirian, now 14 years old, who appeared from behind the homestead, where she had been helping her mother prepare the evening meal. Nasirian had grown taller in the 2 years since Django's departure, but she retained the bright intelligence and gentle manner that had made her such an effective caregiver for the traumatized elephant calf. When she heard Django's name, her eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of joy mixed with concern. Through careful conversation, Dr. Richardson learned that Kamau and his family had never forgotten Django. They spoke of him regularly, wondering how he was adapting to life in the reserve and whether he remembered his time with them. They had wanted to visit him, but had been told by wildlife officials that such contact would be harmful to his adjustment. Nasirian had kept a collection of items associated with their time caring for Django: photographs taken with an old camera, samples of his favorite plants that she had dried and preserved, and a notebook where she had recorded his behaviors and preferences. Most touchingly, she had continued to sing the Maasai lullabies she had created for him during his recovery, hoping somehow that he might hear them across the distance. Kamau revealed that their decision to contact the wildlife authorities about Django had been one of the most difficult of his life. The entire extended family had become attached to the young elephant, who had brought joy to their homestead during a particularly challenging period. They had understood intellectually that Django needed professional care and the company of other elephants, but emotionally, saying goodbye had been devastating. When Dr. Richardson described Django's current condition, his 2-year vigil, his declining health, his apparent wait for something or someone to return, Kamau and Nasirian immediately understood. Elephants, they explained, were known in Maasai tradition as animals with hearts as deep as humans. Stories passed down through generations spoke of elephants who remembered kindness for decades and who could die of grief just as people could. The family's immediate response was to ask how quickly they could see Django. Dr. Richardson explained the potential risks: that the reunion might not go as hoped, that Django might not recognize them after 2 years, or that seeing them again might actually worsen his condition if they had to leave again. Kamau listened to these concerns with the patience of someone accustomed to weighing difficult decisions where the stakes were life and death. After consulting with his wife and extended family, Kamau made his decision. They would travel to see Django regardless of the risks. If he was dying of loneliness, they could at least let him know he hadn't been forgotten. If the reunion proved harmful, they would accept responsibility for that outcome. But they couldn't live with the knowledge that Django was suffering alone when they might be able to help. The journey back to the reserve took on the quality of a pilgrimage. Kamau, Nasirian, and several extended family members traveled in their old Toyota pickup truck following Dr. Richardson's Land Rover along roads that Django would remember from his original journey to the reserve. They brought gifts carefully chosen for their significance: samples of Django's favorite fruits from the homestead, soil from the place where he used to sleep, and recordings of the songs Nasirian had sung to him. As they approached the reserve, Dr. Richardson felt her own tension mounting. Everything depended on Django's reaction to seeing his surrogate family again. If he didn't remember them, or if the reunion caused him additional trauma, she would bear responsibility for a failed intervention that might hasten his death. The reserve's main road came into view as the morning sun reached its zenith. In the distance, beneath the familiar fever tree, Django's massive form was visible in his customary position. He appeared smaller than Dr. Richardson remembered, his bulk diminished by months of poor eating and psychological stress. As the convoy of vehicles approached, following the same route that Django watched every day, something extraordinary began to happen. Long before the vehicles were close enough for visual recognition, Django rose to his feet. His massive ears flapped forward, and his trunk extended high into the air, testing the wind for scents that seemed impossible but achingly familiar. The pickup truck carrying Kamau's family was still several hundred meters away when Django began to trumpet. Not the distressed calls he had made when other vehicles disappointed him, but the joyful, musical trumpeting that elephants use to greet beloved family members after long separations. His entire body language transformed from the listless posture of depression to the animated excitement of recognition and anticipation. As the vehicles drew closer, Django pressed against the reserve's fencing with increasing urgency. His trumpeting became more frequent and more musical, joined by the rumbling vocalizations that elephants use for close-range communication. Other elephants in the area began to gather, drawn by the unusual intensity of Django's calls. When Kamau's pickup truck finally stopped at the same spot where they had said goodbye 2 years earlier, the reunion that followed redefined Dr. Richardson's understanding of the emotional capacity of both elephants and humans. Django's recognition of his surrogate family was immediate and overwhelming. His trumpeting reached crescendos that echoed across the entire reserve, bringing other elephants running to witness this unprecedented display of joy. Nasirian was the first to approach the fence. She called out to Django in Maasai, using the special name she had created for him during their time together, a word that meant heart friend in her traditional language. Django's response was instantaneous. He pressed his massive bulk against the fence, extending his trunk through the wire mesh to touch her face with the same gentle precision he had used when she was 12 years old. The reunion transcended the physical barriers of the fence. Django seemed to recognize not just the individuals he had loved, but the scents, sounds, and emotional resonance of the family that had saved his life. When Kamau approached and placed his weathered hand on Django's trunk, the elephant's entire body relaxed for the first time in 2 years. Dr. Richardson watched with tears streaming down her face as Nasirian began to sing the lullabies she had created for Django during his recovery. The elephant's response was profound. He swayed gently to the rhythm of her voice, his massive head nodding in time with melodies that had comforted him through the darkest period of his young life. The reunion continued for hours, with Django displaying energy and engagement that had been absent for 2 years. He eagerly accepted the fruits and plants that Kamau's family had brought, eating with an appetite that hadn't been seen since his arrival at the reserve. More significantly, he began to vocalize in the complex patterns that elephants use for extended family communication, sounds he had learned during his time with the Maasai family and had apparently been saving for their return. As the day progressed, Dr. Richardson observed changes in Django that went beyond simple excitement. His posture straightened, his movements became more fluid, and his interactions with his environment showed renewed interest and engagement. The depression that had characterized his behavior for 2 years was lifting before her eyes. But the most significant change was in Django's relationship with the other elephants in the reserve. Temba, the elderly matriarch who had tried unsuccessfully to integrate Django into her herd, approached during the reunion. Instead of the indifference or mild tolerance Django had previously shown toward other elephants, he turned to Temba with what could only be described as pride, presenting his human family as if seeking the matriarch's approval. For the first time since his arrival at the reserve, Django seemed to understand that he could maintain connections with both his human family and his elephant community. The reunion had given him permission to belong to both worlds simultaneously. As evening approached, the practical realities of the situation demanded attention. Django couldn't leave the reserve, and Kamau's family couldn't stay indefinitely. Dr. Richardson had violated several protocols by arranging this reunion, and she needed to develop a sustainable plan that would address Django's emotional needs while respecting wildlife management requirements. The solution emerged through careful negotiation with reserve management and consultation with Kamau's family. A formal agreement was established that recognized the unique circumstances of Django's case and the legitimate emotional bonds that had formed during his recovery period. Under this agreement, Kamau's family would be permitted to visit Django monthly, with visits timed to minimize disruption to normal reserve operations. These weren't tourist visits or casual encounters. They were recognized as therapeutic interventions necessary for Django's psychological well-being. In exchange, the family agreed to participate in educational programs that would help other communities understand proper procedures for dealing with orphaned wildlife. The arrangement also established Django as an ambassador for human-wildlife coexistence. His story would be used to illustrate how traditional communities could play positive roles in wildlife conservation when proper support and communication channels existed. Rather than hiding the human-elephant bond that had saved Django's life, the reserve would celebrate it as an example of conservation success. Within weeks of the first reunion, Django's transformation was remarkable. His skin infections cleared as his stress levels decreased and his immune system strengthened. His weight returned to healthy levels as his appetite normalized. Most importantly, he abandoned his solitary vigil beneath the fever tree and began to integrate with the elephant community he had rejected for 2 years. Temba's herd welcomed Django with the patience and wisdom that characterized elephant social structures. They seemed to understand that his previous rejection hadn't been personal, but had resulted from grief and longing that they couldn't address. With that emotional wound finally healing, Django was free to form the elephant relationships that would sustain him throughout his life. The monthly visits became celebrations that enriched the entire reserve community. Django would begin anticipating each visit days in advance, displaying excitement that was infectious among the other elephants. When Kamau's family arrived, the reunion ritual became a spectacle that drew wildlife researchers, reserve staff, and carefully selected visitors who wanted to witness this extraordinary example of interspecies connection. Nasirian, now pursuing education that would allow her to work in wildlife conservation, used these visits to deepen her understanding of elephant behavior and psychology. She began documenting Django's development and the ways his dual identity as both elephant and honorary family member influenced his interactions with both humans and his own species. Dr. Richardson's bold decision to reunite Django with his surrogate family became a catalyst for broader policy changes within the wildlife conservation community. The case study demonstrated that rigid separation between rescued animals and their human caregivers wasn't always beneficial, and that carefully managed ongoing relationships could actually support conservation goals. The success led to the establishment of community liaison programs that better integrated traditional communities into wildlife rescue and rehabilitation efforts. Local communities were recognized not just as potential threats to wildlife, but as essential partners whose knowledge and compassion could make the difference between life and death for orphaned or injured animals. Django's story spread beyond the boundaries of the Masai Mara, becoming a symbol of hope for wildlife conservation efforts across Africa. It illustrated that conservation wasn't just about protecting animals from humans, but about nurturing the deep connections that could exist between species when approached with wisdom, patience, and love. 6 months after the reunion, Django had become one of the most socially integrated elephants in the reserve. He maintained his special relationship with Kamau's family while forming strong bonds with Temba's herd. Young elephants in the reserve sought his company, perhaps drawn to the unique combination of elephant wisdom and human understanding that characterized his personality. During the monthly visits, Django would demonstrate behaviors that amazed researchers and visitors alike. He would position himself at the fence exactly as he had during his vigil, but now the waiting was joyful anticipation rather than desperate longing. When his human family arrived, he would trumpet his greetings and then turn to include the other elephants in the celebration, as if introducing family members to each other. Nasirian continued to sing to Django during each visit, but the songs had evolved from the comforting lullabies of his recovery to celebratory chants that honored his growth and strength. Django would sway to these melodies, sometimes joined by other elephants who had learned to recognize the music as a signal for gathering and celebration. Kamau brought traditional Maasai blessings to each visit, offering prayers for Django's health and happiness that drew from centuries of coexistence between his people and the wildlife of East Africa. These ceremonies honored the ancient relationship between Maasai communities and elephants, acknowledging both species as inhabitants of a shared landscape with mutual responsibilities for each other's well-being. The visits also became educational opportunities for younger members of both the Maasai community and the reserve staff. Children learned about elephant behavior and conservation needs, while adults shared traditional knowledge about wildlife management and the cultural significance of elephants in Maasai society. Dr. Richardson documented every aspect of Django's recovery and the ongoing success of the visitation program. Her research contributed to a growing body of evidence supporting more nuanced approaches to wildlife rehabilitation that considered the emotional and psychological needs of individual animals rather than applying universal protocols, regardless of circumstances. The data showed that Django's integration with the elephant community had actually accelerated after his reunion with his human family. Rather than competing loyalties, the two relationships seemed to reinforce each other. His confidence and emotional stability with humans translated into better social skills with elephants, while his growing elephant identity enhanced his ability to serve as a bridge between species. As Django approached his 10th birthday, he had become a mature young elephant with the promise of leadership within Temba's herd. His unique background, orphaned by human cruelty, saved by human compassion, and raised by both species, gave him insights that made him particularly effective at navigating the complex relationships between wildlife and human communities. The monthly visits continued, but they evolved as Django's needs changed. As a mature elephant, he required less emotional support and more intellectual stimulation. Nasirian, now studying wildlife biology, brought research projects and conservation challenges to discuss during their visits. Kamau shared news from the broader Maasai community about wildlife management issues and traditional conservation practices that could inform modern approaches. These conversations, conducted in the mixture of Maasai, Swahili, and elephant vocalizations that had become their family language, addressed complex topics about land use, human-wildlife conflict, and sustainable development. Django's responses, while obviously nonverbal, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the issues that affected both his human and elephant communities. The success of Django's case inspired similar programs across East Africa, where other orphaned elephants were reunited with their temporary caregivers under carefully managed conditions. Not every case achieved the dramatic success of Django's story, but the principle of recognizing and honoring significant interspecies relationships became an accepted part of wildlife rehabilitation protocols. Dr. Richardson's research contributed to international wildlife management standards that emphasize the importance of individual animal psychology in determining appropriate care strategies. The rigid, one-size-fits-all approaches that had nearly cost Django his life were replaced by more flexible protocols that considered the specific history and needs of each rescued animal. The program also strengthened relationships between wildlife reserves and local communities by demonstrating that traditional caregivers could play ongoing positive roles in conservation efforts. Rather than being excluded from wildlife management decisions, communities like Kamau's became partners in developing sustainable approaches to human-wildlife coexistence. 10 years after Django's original rescue, the young elephant who had nearly died of loneliness had become a symbol of hope for wildlife conservation across Africa. His story demonstrated that love transcends species barriers and that the most effective conservation strategies often emerge from recognizing and nurturing the natural connections between humans and wildlife. Django's legacy extended beyond his individual story to influence policy changes, research directions, and community engagement strategies throughout the conservation world. His monthly reunions with Kamau's family continued, evolving from desperate therapy sessions to joyful celebrations that honored the bonds between all members of his extended interspecies family. The fever tree beneath which Django had maintained his lonely vigil still stood at the edge of the reserve, but its meaning had transformed completely. No longer a symbol of desperate waiting and unrequited longing, it had become a landmark of hope, a reminder that patient love, whether between humans or between species, can overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. As visitors to the reserve learned Django's story, they carried its message beyond the boundaries of the Masai Mara to communities around the world. The tale of an orphaned elephant who nearly died of loneliness until love reunited him with his surrogate family became a powerful metaphor for the connections that bind all living beings together. Django's story reminded everyone who heard it that love transcends species, and that sometimes the greatest conservation efforts aren't about protecting animals from humans, but about honoring the bonds that make us all family. In a world where human-wildlife conflict dominated conservation discussions, Django offered proof that cooperation, understanding, and mutual respect could create outcomes that benefited both species far more than separation ever could. The lonely vigil had ended, but the love that sustained it continued to grow, creating ripples of positive change that would influence wildlife conservation for generations to come. In the heart of Kenya's Masai Mara, beneath an ancient fever tree, the impossible had become not just possible, but a beacon of hope for a world learning to recognize the profound connections that unite all life.